making the trip and taking the time out of your schedules to come down here to Utah Valley University. Most of you probably know me. My name is David Barker. I'm the program chair for the new architecture program here at UVU. And well, it's always our privilege and honor. We're so lucky and grateful to have a good relationship, working relationship with the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art here at the Utah chapter. By having that partnership, well, they're able to help us bring in such quality speakers here to UVU as our fledgling program continues to grow and gain some notoriety. So, with that said, I'm going to turn the time over to Paul Monson, the Utah chapter president of the ICAA, who will then introduce our speaker for the evening.
Thank you, David. Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Monson. I'm the president of the Utah chapter of the Institute of Classical Architecture and Art. And many of you have been to our events before, but for those who have not, the ICAA is the largest nonprofit in the country dedicated to promoting the classical tradition in art and architecture. And it's really been a wonderful privilege to be partnering with Utah Valley University as they begin this architecture program here. We're trying to bring in some great speakers. This is going to be the second of 8 lectures that we hold here this semester. So we're grateful to Eric Osth, who's come all the way from Pittsburgh to speak to us tonight. We've also been blessed to partner with the Utah chapter of the AIA. If you'd like AIA credits for continuing education for this class, we'll be passing around a sign-up sheet. And you can put your number down and you can get continuing education credits. And there's also a spot on the sheet to mark if you'd like to be included in our mailing list. That way you can find out about our events and we can let you know about all the exciting things that we're doing here in Utah. If you're looking for something that's a little more hands-on, you know, everybody likes a good lecture, but if you like to actually draw and try things with paper and pencil, and you'd like design and want to try some of the principles and concepts that we're talking about, in a couple of weeks, we have Matt McNicholas coming in. He'll be giving a lecture here on Wednesday evening. And then the following day, Thursday, he's going to teach a beginning class here at UVU on how to design architectural ornament. You see buildings sometimes, an ornament can either be like really inspiring and beautiful, or it kind of looks like clip art. And how do you really design architectural ornament well? That's what Matt's going to be teaching. The following day, on Friday, he'll be teaching a more advanced class in Salt Lake City. So you can take a beginning class here on Thursday, and then his advanced class up in Salt Lake on Friday. If you're interested in any of those classes, if you want to sign up for any of our events, you go to classicistutah.org. That's our website, classicistutah.org, and that's where you can register for any of the events that we have coming up. If you're a member of the ICAA, then you get discounted admission to not just the events we have here in Utah, but all across the country. There's 15 chapters of the ICAA, from Florida to New York to California. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. Eric Osth is the Vice Chairman at Urban Design Associates in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He received his Bachelor of Architecture from the University of Miami and a master's degree in urban design from California, Berkeley. He worked for Skidmore, Owens & Merrill, and joined Urban Design Associates in 2004. Around 2005, Eric and his colleagues at UDA began working with many communities here in Utah, including DAYBREAK. They've done a lot of the design work for that city. And Eric travels here to Utah so often, I see him more than I see some of my friends who live here in Utah. We are really privileged to have Eric working on some of our communities here in Utah. He is one of the bright stars in design, both in architecture and urban design, and let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul, for the very kind introduction. It's been great being friends with Paul for so many years, and I really appreciate what you've been doing with the ICA here in Utah. Is unbelievable. I mean, the fact that you're able to have such an amazing chapter and all the hard work by all the ICA members is extraordinary. You should be very proud of yourselves. And I also want to say thank you to the UDA students and the faculty for the invitation to speak to you today. I just want to mention, just in general, I think UVU is doing you a great service. I can tell you that as a firm that hires architects that do traditional classical architecture, there's definitely a deficit of students in relationship to jobs. So you're in an opportunity where you can get out and actually do a lot of implementation of the things that you're talking about here. The firms that do, the schools that do have programs like this, the students have a complete competitive advantage over students that don't. So you're in a very good position, and I think you're going to be well served by your degree from UVU. And thank you, David, for hosting the lecture series and doing such great work with the school. Lecture today is Architecture for Urbanism. The Architecture for Suburbanism lecture is in another building across the way. So we're just going to talk about urban topologies. For those of you who are AIA members, you can read this, you're going to get all that at some point in the lecture today. There's always issues going on in the world at all times. Things that are coming at you, there's always a number of things going, and these are things that are constantly, things that as an architect and an urban designer, whatever they may be, your work needs to understand these, and you need to be part of what you're about solving that problem. So the question is, what is urban design? And I know that I oftentimes, when I went to get a degree for urban design, I was working for a single-family architect that was doing a lot of work that I liked, and when I decided at one point that I realized that I didn't have the patience to work on one house a year. The first step to recovery is admitting you have a problem that I don't have a lot of patience, but I knew that I wanted to work on a larger amount of projects, and I would want to affect a greater number of people. So I decided to go to follow a career in urban design. And the first day of the seminar of the course, the professor asked us, he said, I want to go around to everybody in the 9 or 10 folks that were in the seminar. I want to ask everybody to tell me what urban design is. And each of us had, in the first day, had a completely different answer. And then he said, okay, we're going to go through the whole semester, and then I'm going to ask you that same question again. And at the end of the semester, we all had a different answer. I mean, it's crazy that we went through a whole program, and we still have different answers about what urban design is and the definition. So it's obviously extremely broadly defined. It means different things to different people. Quite simply, I like to say it's just design of urban environments, to keep it simple. But certainly, what your job is, and a lot of times a kind of conventional definition is the intersection of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning. But whatever that may be, your job as an urban designer is to understand and let your theory and design wrap around those issues that I mentioned, whatever those may be, policy, public interest, practicality, whatever the things that are going on in the world at that point, that's your job to respond to those. So we're going to look into the 20th century a little bit and talk about some of the planning movements that have suggested or have had influences on the work that we do and the work that's going on in the world, and what are some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses of those individual movements. This is Frederick Olmsted, who, if you don't know him, you should absolutely know a lot of his work. He was a journalism major at Yale. He moved on to landscape architecture, obviously, and he consulted to cities everywhere. He had an incredible amount of influence. I don't know how many times I go to a city and somebody says, you really ought to go over there because Olmsted did some work there. So it's quite impressive, his reach. And to do that before the turn of the 20th century on a railroad car is quite extraordinary. But one of the things that in his best known work is Central Park. We all know Central Park. Is the fact that this is at an amazing civic scale, almost a national scale, yet when you're in that space, you feel like a king. You've got incredible human scale elements from within it, and it works extremely well. Now, one of the things that he understood is at that time, he understood that at the time, their modern medicine at that time felt that there was medicinal qualities to being in nature, and to that it has, you know, it had healing powers and things like that. By the way, there's nothing wrong with that. Even today, you can find that there are people that feel that that was very strong. But this was an opportunity for political will and for politicians to actually build what people were asking for. So it's an opportunity. The cities were very dirty, didn't have a lot of open space. So here was an opportunity to actually to build that and to experience nature. But there was a second thing that was going on with Central Park that's important to know, is that it was also a real estate play for upper Manhattan and for just beyond Midtown. And you can actually see in this slide, you can see obviously the value that the park created along the properties there, and you can see the drop in value right behind it. So even just a building below, it didn't have the exact same economic value. So oftentimes when you see something responding to a societal need, but also an economic need at the same time, is important to moving your work forward. And Olmsted was a major contributor to the City Beautiful movement, of which this is the 1893 World's Fair in my hometown of Chicago. There was Olmsted did the landscape, which I love, kind of every once in a while you get a tree just kind of like surprises you in the pathways. And so Olmsted was one of the few that was not actually a trained classicist. All the architects that were working on this were from the Beaux Arts. There was a significant number of classically trained architects that were going over to France, learning French architecture, and then working within the United States. And they created this incredible ensemble of buildings. But in order to get to the fair, you actually needed to go through some of the slums of Chicago. And you saw all of the characteristics of what was going on with overcrowding, and this is the kind of way people were living in the city. So the cities were considered extremely gritty, extremely challenging, and there were a lot of people wanting to do something about that within the United States. So in some ways, when you rolled through those dirty parts of the city and pulled up and you walked into that, it was a little bit like the Sienese fresco of the allegory of good and bad government. There was certainly a position where you recognized the fact that this was what cities should be like. And so 1 in 7 Americans visited the World's Fair. So it was an incredible opportunity to market or to give a new impression for what American urbanism and American cities would be like. And at the same time, this is also the time when the Americans were growing in terms of it being an imperial power, and starting to travel around the country, around the world. And there needed to be an expression of American architecture beyond what at the time was kind of Italianate Victorian architecture. So this had an incredible amount more civic pride and an opportunity to exhibit what City Beautiful, about what cities could be. So the City Beautiful movement was a group of architects who were going around consulting to cities and doing master planning. There was about over 70 City Beautiful plans in the United States, some of which were implemented well, some were not. We'll talk about that in a second. One of the ones that was one of the most famous plans was the plan of Chicago. Again, my hometown, which happens to be on the top of the slide. But it truly was a regional plan. In fact, they started at the scale of the Midwest and worked down into the scale of the city. And talking about the kind of radial plan and how this is the center of an incredible network. And it really was. Chicago at that time was the kind of capital of the Midwest. Maybe it still is in some ways, but it certainly was about bringing commerce to Chicago. And this was sponsored by the Chicago Commerce Club, I think that's what it's called. And they were definitely interested in bringing investment to Chicago. So this was an investment play. And a considerable amount of the plan was actually built here. And the park system there is fantastic, actually. Where they were failed was implementing their civic center. And I know that a lot of classicists, nothing's going to be sacred in this room. A lot of classicists hold up this as a great model for a kind of center of a city. And actually, when you look at this, you would be taking your life in your own hands across this space as a pedestrian. This is like 2 or 3 city blocks wide. There isn't a lot of green space. The ratio of the building programming to the space is incredibly low. It took an incredible amount of property off the tax rolls. So there's all kinds of things that it's quite dramatic in its beauty when you look at it for a moment, but then when you actually think, do you really want to put a lawn chair down in the middle of that space and enjoy the space? You probably don't. But what the City Beautiful movement did, and this is what's important, is to look at things critically, particularly over time. It did focus characteristics on creating great civic architecture. And at the same time, one of the failures of the City Beautiful movement was it didn't deal with housing. It didn't deal with the way people lived in the city. So the whole thing I was talking about, the trains rolling through the suburbs, it had no answers for that, and it didn't actually deal with that, which was one of its great failures. And why it opened itself up to other movements surpassing it. So there's also interesting when you look at some of the text and the way the kind of theory evolved in relationship to its context. You can see this. So the one at the top, they would the first time when they first started talking about classical architecture, you do all the reading, all the theory, they used to talk about the fact that the dome has to be in the center. The absolute center has to be dominated by civic buildings, because any of that riffraff of commercial buildings and all that stuff that needs to be spread around, needs to be somewhere else. But what happened was it created value, and then all of a sudden skyscrapers would obscure the dome. So the later writing actually positioned the dome. They used to say, well, you need to keep the dome in the center outside of the commercial center because they can't be involved, so that way you can see it against the sky. You can actually see somewhat of this influence in Salt Lake City. This would be on a hill, but you can see that that is actually very separate from the downtown. I don't know if that was intentional or having anything to do with City Beautiful movement. In fact, it probably wasn't, but nevertheless, you can see that kind of relationship of the state to the downtown.
Olmsted's son did the landscape plan for the capital.
Oh, nice, yeah. Olmsted. I know, that guy was on cranes all the time. So I always feel like when I'm on planes all the time, and I say, well, at least I'm on where Olmsted was, and just getting one place to another. But this is San Francisco, which also has a City Beautiful plan. They did it in about 1904, right before the earthquake. In fact, that would have been a great opportunity to implement the plan. But they were too busy rebuilding as they were. They didn't let a good crisis create a great opportunity. So they did this in getting ready for the Pan-Pacific exhibition, which was when they opened the Panama Canal. You can see that they actually created a plan here separate from the downtown. So that's an example of this being built. Now, one thing that I want to mention is that it took San Francisco, for all of its economic power, they built the last building, which is actually this one, which was actually done by Paycott Freed, and I think it was like I read about, I think it was in the mid-90s. So it took almost 80 years to build out that city. So one of the things that I want to impart to you as a student is to always be comfortable with your phase one. We'll talk about that in the diagram in a second. But this particular City Hall is actually quite beautiful. It's by Arthur Brown Jr. He is a classical student. You should look him up. He worked at a time when things where modernism was starting to creep in, and he didn't deal with economy, but he did an incredible number of great buildings that are worth checking out. So this is in terms of getting comfortable with your phase one. A lot of the City Beautiful movements were overly ambitious. They would have a vision plan like the one on the left, and then they end up years and years later, other movements would build it out, and you might get things that you were uncomfortable with. So that's something to think about in the way you design things. Think about frameworks for growth, and think about how your plan may be interpreted by other people in the future. The other thing that the City movement gave us was it helped create a kind of way in which to deal with architecture and civic architecture in different ways. So for example, you can see that diagram on the right manifested across the bay from San Francisco and Oakland, where they put all the administrative units in one tower and really put like kind of a little dome on top, and then you have a civic building. This is actually a great model for thinking about how your work can last forever, is if you give it a kind of economic driver and flexibility for change. And that's something that a lot of architects have forgotten over the years, and you see things get torn down. I know that as classicists, a lot of people will talk about Penn Station. There's a lot of, as you'll probably read about that in architectural history class, you'll talk about that. Penn Station was one of the most beautiful American works of civic architecture. It was gorgeous. And it wasn't a great work of urban design, it didn't interact with the street real well, but it was torn down in the 60s to build Madison Square Garden. Now, there's all this big movement of trying to rebuild Penn Station. They would not be having that problem if they had a tower on top, so I'm just telling you. So if you think about it, the ones that did survive, Grand Central, which did have a movement to save it, has 2 towers on top of it. Penn Station in Pittsburgh is a beautiful building by Daniel Burnham and has a tower on top. So think about that. Think about frameworks for growth and think about how your work will move forward. You probably didn't think you were going to get a history lesson, but you are. So you do a little bit more. So the Garden City movement was one that was dealing at the same time as the City Beautiful movement, but was dealing with the garden cities, that dealing with the suburbs, dealing with the growth outside of the cities. As I mentioned, the cities were really quite challenging to live in, and people wanted to reconcile this problem and solve it. And so Raven Unwin came around and created this diagram, which is still something that's valuable today. The idea of a center city and the greenways and connections to sub-centers around the city at manageable scale, transportation around it. This is like a template. You could drop this down and you can use this forever. I mean, what a brilliant tool that they provided for us. They also were very tied into private developers. If the City Beautiful movement would be, its example is that it was really involved with city government and in the center of cities and restoration of cities. Garden Cities was really about a little bit about building anew. There's a great book by Robert Stern called Paradise Plan on all the Garden City movements. It's 8.5 pounds, and it's like this thick, and it has all of the Garden Cities in there. So it's an incredible amount of research. It has an incredibly broad influence, but I would definitely recommend taking a look at that. But it's kind of hilarious because when you look back on a lot of the ads you would see for towns, they talk about this, living and working in the smoke, living in the suburbs, living and working in the sun. And this was a dream and a goal, and then you see like factory and a garden, there's no factory, but where's the factory? But that's the way in which a lot of the Garden City movement was a little bit about advertising, it was about trying to reconcile those things. I thought it was funny because I went to school in Coral Gables, Florida, which is at the south end of Florida. It's really hot and humid, and I saw and that was a Garden City, and they would advertise in New York City and get people to buy property down there. And there was an ad they ran in the New York Times that said Coral Gables, and it said 75 degrees, no humidity, exclamation point, which is totally, it's like a jungle, So the buildings are starting to sand, everything's wet because of, it's just, it's amazing, the water just sticks to things. But the Garden City movement gave us a great toolkit for how to build at various densities, an incredibly gorgeous toolkit of how to design streets and park spaces and things. And the initial part of the early Garden City movement was connected to transit. And we're going to talk about a little bit of where it started to go wrong. They started working with the Regional Planning Association of America, and they started dealing with the car. The car, at the same time these other movements were dealing with transit and things like that, and all of a sudden people started getting their cars, and the growth of cars is considerable, and then people start dying. And then all of a sudden, as architects and urban designers, the politicians and developers said, you need to deal with this. You need to figure out how you're going to reconcile this problem. How are we going to accommodate the car in the way in which you build? This is a model for what they call Radburn. When you look at it a little bit, I'll explain a little bit some of the big things. Is that, for one thing, this is the first superblock development. And once we started getting ourselves safe with superblocks, it's game over. And most of development around the region is superblocks. The other thing is that it was all cul-de-sacs. It was the first cul-de-sac development. Now what they did was they put the front doors of the houses on these green belts, which this is the very humanistic side of it. But this was the first project that completely separated the sidewalk, the pedestrian, and the car. Completely separated them, and they stopped dealing with them. They had underpasses to go between the roads, so you never dealt with the roads. And that was the problem, is that from here on out, we no longer have comprehensively dealing with cars and pedestrians. And now you talk to traffic engineers, and it won't, the idea of them interacting in cities is over. And this was really the first project to do it. And the other problem was that it actually became the forerunner to all of our cul-de-sac developments. You can see they just kind of value engineered out get rid of the green belt. The living space is in the same place, and the entry is now on the vehicle side. So we lost neighborhoods as a result of it. And in some ways, it also became the kind of modern day golf course development, which you see in a number of places where the cul-de-sac development is. mentioned. Then you also see Wright dealing with Broadacre City and the idea of completely automobile suburbs. Wright was very late to the game in planning. This is the Depression. He didn't have a whole lot going. So he's at the back of the line, and urban design decides to go to the front of the line and says that I'm going to come up with the first automobile suburb. They never really actually built the true Broadacre City. I think he had it that the architect was in charge, was like the mayor of the town. You know, I think we could see that. As architects, we could tell that was not, that was never going to get anywhere. It would continue. But nevertheless, it was a completely agrarian community, but with skyscrapers occasionally. The next thing to come around was Siam. Le Corbusier was a big part of this. It was another urban design movement where they started to do imagery like this. This is, when you look at this, I'll kind of break this down for you. You can see that everything is treated the same. Every single building, these are supposed to be mixed-use buildings, but every single floor is exactly the same width. There's no difference in orientation between the 20th floor and the 15th floor. The section is exactly the same. And this is where, when you intersect like what at the time was kind of considered slick design with economy, it's going to take off. So we're never going to get sectional changes in houses again. You're never going to get a lot of hierarchy. So this has been built over and over again. You see that outside of most cities. But one is really strong about this image to me is that it's very intentional that the pedestrian and the human scale is not part of this equation anymore. And what is unfortunate is that although that vision was that all the parking was going to be underground, eventually the market, you always have to find what your financial kind of weaknesses and your economic weaknesses. The idea that everybody was going to build parking garages underground was never going to happen. They built this, this is everywhere. The surface parking lots. In fact, we had a client in Las Vegas, and we had to go to their offices, and they had a building, and then 15 minutes away, we were at a 15-minute walk away. We found a hotel, and we decided to walk across the parking lots, try to go from parking lot to parking lot. We figured we could try to make it, and it was much harder. It was much more difficult to live in that place or try to deal with that place if it was a pedestrian than it would have been as a car. We had to go across a drainage ditch, we had to climb a fence, and with our bags and everything. It was so literally the way in which city zoning has gone in this direction, it's made it very difficult. So and then obviously the car, which is so much part of that vision, became the thing that they imprisoned. It was supposed to allow for more freedom. It was supposed to allow for more space. And it certainly didn't happen, and I think we all know about what this feels like. It also became the model for public housing moving forward. This is the Robert Taylor homes. I grew up north of Chicago. These were in Chicago, and I remember driving past this on the freeway. This was kind of like when you drove past it as a kid, you say, oh, that's where, you think that's where the poor people live. This was a fundamentally flawed direction for how to deal with low-income housing. It took them, they were in what people considered at the time slums of multifamily housing, but they lived on a street and they had a social structure on the street. And they could live in the street and people could watch each other, and they had a whole network of neighborhood, but it was also pedestrian focused, it was human scale. And they said, well, what we really need is they need light and air and they need green space. And what happened was the spaces between, which were the green spaces that Corbusier wanted, we became no man's lands, and then also they were engineered for people to get out of them as quickly as possible. So once the elevators went out of service because they couldn't maintain them, the conditions became worse and worse. And these were eventually torn down, and it was as a completely flawed vision. So recognizing that in that context was when UDA was founded. We were founded in 1964. I'm a fourth generation partner in the firm. That's David Lewis on the right. He was very much a believer that people that is a rebuttal to the buildings that I just showed you, is that people should have a voice in their communities. The other thing he was also believed in was that cities were worth saving, which was a pretty revolutionary idea. At the time, urban renewal was clearing cities out. Urban was a four-letter word, and then nobody even knew what urban design was because it wasn't actually a profession at the time. So I have no idea how he ever thought that he was going to have a business when you have a business name for something that doesn't actually exist. And urban is a bad word. You generally need something bad. I'm very impressed that we made it as far as we did. But it was put together in the civil rights movement with the fundamental idea that if we were to put ourselves together, on sidewalks, we might learn more from each other, and that we might realize that we have more in common than we really think. And that need at that time was incredibly important, and I think it's as much important today as it was then, in finding that we have common ground and things to use, things that bind us together. And so we also, he invented, he didn't invent, but he brought the public process into practice. And the idea of restoring existing cities and listening was the major part of the process. So the pedestrian in the city was the key part of it. And when you talk about a lot of those movements, the areas that are pedestrian, that were successful, are the ones that continue to be maintained and continue to flourish. Our process was really about listening. This is kind of one of my little cartoons of what we do is, we listen to people, we listen to our consultants, our clients, and then we test some alternatives, and then we decide. It's pretty simple as that. But listening is a big part of our process, and we typically don't design without listening first. So whenever we're working, we don't kind of design something and then unveil it. We hear first, which is not too unique anymore, certainly. Some of our projects, we've worked in West Donlands, which is in Toronto, which has been constructed, which was part of a major public process. That district won a ULI Global Award. We worked in South Lake Union in Seattle. This is a major tech district and innovation district. It's kind of a model today. This is a project I worked on as well. It's the new capital city for Moscow. It was part of an international competition. They decided not to move the government uses in, but it is under construction. And then I'm working right now in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia with Dwani Plater-Zyberk and SWA and Jacobs on the revitalization of central Riyadh, which is a city that's area that's 350,000. It's the largest revitalization project in the world. So it's been exciting. Our reach has actually grown far outside of the modest beginnings in Pittsburgh and around the world, and trying to create visions for how Saudi Arabia's historic center can grow and be part of their traditions that they had lost. They've actually stopped building. They actually started building the way Corbu talked about with towers and outside of this. So now they're looking at kind of rebuilding some of the inner parts of their city to be part of their lives. And so a lot of times people ask me kind of what I do and what is kind of, we talked about that what is urban design quote, and this quote always sticks with me. It was one of my professors used it, and he said that was paraphrased a couple of ways. My professor was Charles Correa, and he paraphrased Jack Robertson, who was an architect out of New York City, a wonderful urbanist. But he says, designing a building on Bedford Square is easy. Bedford Square is the machine, and I'm designing the spare part. However, working in America's Harder, where I feel like I'm designing amongst a bunch of spare parts with no one specifically in charge of the machine, which I think is pretty accurate. So on the left side, this kind of through the auto area, a lot of that is through the automobile, because this was a pedestrian scaled space. Bedford Square, as an architect, you're doing a blue building, you drop it in, it's pretty easy. What we kind of do is kind of like the top right. We get a site which looks like this and has a couple of different things that are working, and then we're trying to put something together like that. Now, what we found more and more is that our sites aren't always like easy to understand, and the spare parts that we're dealing with, like on the right, are not always necessarily buildings. Sometimes it's perception, sometimes it's economics, sometimes it's different challenges become our spare parts. And we create these, there are some critical issues that we're dealing with today. The cities are disconnected. You really rely mostly on one form of travel. Salt Lake has been great about implementing a light rail system. Without that, I think it would be really challenging, particularly, but it's been a great step forward. Design of the urban landscape is really, it's quite corporate, non-existent. I mean, when you drive on the I-15, Paul and I were driving here, it's quite, when you look around, the design is not a major part of it, whether or not it's an architect or not. Housing is a big problem in Salt Lake particularly, but also in many cities around the country. And the atmosphere is an issue. The kind of carbon, the amount of carbon coming out of buildings is 40% of the atmosphere, right? Or 40% of the problem right now of carbon emissions. And not only that, the systems that bring you to the buildings are also considerable problems. So how do you create cities that have landmarks, that have incredible connections, and the sense of place that when you get around is always a challenge. And I wanted to mention that there's one that I'm particularly proud of, that we've been able to participate in, that you should take a look at. It's DAYBREAK here in Salt Lake. It's a new city of itself. It's largely built by production builders. That's the lion's share of what you see. It's really a kind of a laboratory for design and construction of what you can build today. Some folks look at it and say, oh gosh, it could be a lot better. Absolutely, but right now the context is what today's constraints is what's giving you there. And DAYBREAK has an incredible team working on this design. We're going to talk about that in a second, but it really reestablished a tradition of neighborhood building by builders, which had been lost. In fact, when you look back, every city across the country has these great American neighborhoods. You can find almost every city, and even today we were talking about one in south of Utah County here, and there's these incredible neighborhoods, and they have a network. Those were built by builders, and they were built oftentimes with a pattern book in their back pocket, like the one on the right. So they are definitely major contributors to the American landscape. So you, as architects getting out into the world, that I want to recommend is that builders are the ones that are really doing all the work. We like to think that we're great. They think at the human scale in terms of they think about their buyers, and certainly they're kind of learning how to build neighborhoods together, how to connect them together, and make places now. But the number on the bottom here is amazing to me. 1.29 million housing starts in 2019. Less than 2% of them were designed by architects. So we designed one of the two. I don't know if that's in the 2%, but that's an amazing number. So even if, let's just say they're up by factor 2, it's 4%. That still means there's a huge amount of the American landscape is being built, and that's going every year. So as an architect, when you get up and you work, if you get yourself involved with production builders, you can make an incredible influence on the American landscape. When DAYBREAK started, it was relatively, it really was a series with a vision for an incredible connected community. And right off the bat, the problem is that it was an incredible view, but it really was quite it was like a moonscape out there. Post-industrial property at the base of one of the mines. And they were not getting exactly the architecture through an incredible push. They were still not getting the results that they wanted. And they have an incredible team. Katie is here representing the DAYBREAK team, as well as Stephen James and Jeff Farnham doing an incredible job. And what we noticed is that they asked UDA to come in and to give them a pattern book to help set a set of design guidelines of which to use to work with the builders as a tool. And what we've noticed is that absolutely when you're building communities, you need three things. You need a really well-intentioned builder that's interested in helping build the community. You need a great team like Katie's team, and you also need a builder that is, designer that will work together. It's like a three-legged stool. You really need that to happen in order to make that work. And part of our pattern book process was to analyze great neighborhoods of Salt Lake, and some of the DNA of that was put into the pattern book. And then we also helped vision what the place could be like, and helped in terms of design of product to frame some of the spaces as part of the master plan, including townhomes there and active adult product on the right. So here's an example of a few of the houses that we had designed with builders that were doing some of the products like the ones you saw a moment ago. What's interesting is that although these builders, at this time, we helped them design single-family products they're now doing, working at 40 units an acre. And I told them at the time, I said, eventually you're going to get 40 units an acre apartment buildings. They said, no, that's crazy. So, and sure enough they are. It's just a matter of the fact that you can see, as an architect and an urban designer, you can see, okay, land economies are going this direction, and people are living other places like this. It's certainly going to happen at some point. And that same builder is building streets and sidewalks that are walkable and pedestrian-oriented, and gardens, fencing, and landscape that is really setting a good framework for the house around it. I'm going to take you through a couple of the neighborhoods in DAYBREAK. We'll start with Garden Park. This is another one that was really built in a kind of cottage tradition. DAYBREAK hits a lot of different markets, and it depends on where you come from. It's like you mentioned, it's a city in and of itself. So some of the neighborhoods are for a particular type of market, and depending upon the way you drive in, will definitely affect your experience and how you perceive it. So you need to look at it kind of comprehensively to understand it. Garden Park, which we're talking about here, is this group right there of houses, of which we helped one of the builders create a kind of master plan, which had a series of walking corridors through it and connecting it to the water. And then at the center of the space, and we helped them vision for it based on a lot of the cottage scale housing that's outside of Salt Lake, or sorry, outside of downtown Salt Lake, and how those would be part of green spaces and walking spaces. We looked at the central green and how people were walking and approaching it. We oftentimes think about that, about how the connections outside the neighborhood go in terms of creating that walkability in the pedestrian environment. So even if we're sometimes thinking about how we're walking into other people's projects and other people's streets and things like that, so that it becomes one place. That's always our goal. In fact, I want to mention that sometimes I get comments. We do so many plans. We've done, I think, 2,300 plans and master plans in the history of our firm. And every once in a while, somebody will say, "Hey, I can't believe I didn't know you guys worked on that district. It just blends right in." That's like the nicest compliment. Okay, we did our job. That's good. That's what we want to be doing. We want things to blend into the neighborhood. So thinking about how people approach the site, we designed a clubhouse that was part of the center of the community. This has been built, and one of the goals of what we were trying to do was we had 12,000 square feet, so we had to kind of spread it out around the property, and we had to really watch the roof lines really carefully. But it also had a civic role as well, and it was the challenge of how do you take a one-story building and create civic moments. Like this particular entrance piece, we kind of popped that up as a kind of double height space, and then created a rhythm of a large scale room and a sense of something larger appended to it to kind of bookend the two. And then we had to create a series of moments along the building to create places for your eye to rest as you move across it. And then sometimes it's important, we like to have buildings kind of open up like that seam there, so it kind of gives you a surprise and so forth, and lights up somewhat like a beacon like it is right now. The interior spaces, these are production. This is a production building, this is a commercial side of the production building, and working with them to kind of create kind of spaces that look kind of custom design. It's one of the larger assembly spaces. This is so we also worked on some condominium buildings, like this one, which are also, you can see them built here. We also did a whole cottage suite, and one of the challenges what we're doing at Daybreak is that it's important in a suburban environment. A lot of times it's criticized because of the repetition and the similar characteristics throughout. So what we're trying to do with the work in Garden Park is how do we create the same product type, but then create a number of different elevations so you get the sense of a custom house or a custom environment and a feeling like you live in an environment that you have your own private place and private living there. So a lot of these are just kind of like different suits of clothes on the same plan. So with it behind it, it has so that you've got a variety of streetscapes like that. And different types of housing shape and sizes of that are responding to the program behind it. We also did a product called the Mansionette, which was another one which was very small row house, townhouse type, where again it was where we had 3 different elevations, but then we realized quickly that we could take different elevations and connect them together and create different buildings. So in the process, we were able to do this, where you kind of could take different combinations of buildings and stick them together, so you can create streets of the same architecture, but turning them around in different ways to creating a sense of variety. And this would definitely impact the streetscapes. So this has been one of the things that's helpful when you're working with builders, that they have a product type. They want to have a few to sell to buyers that represent some of their markets. But the other thing is that a lot of times people do have different taste on what they want on the exterior, and as well, even this kind of gives you a sense of pride of ownership to having your own address. Some waterfront condominiums we worked on at Daybreak also. These are a different type, which are flats stacked here. But the idea is how do these come together to create basically almost like big houses. So there's one there. And one of the things I mentioned a lot about is about the pedestrian and about the walkability of neighborhoods. There's a walking path that wraps the lake here. So a lot of all these types, you can see they have an incredible, like a large percentage of glass, but also a large amount of balconies and porches across the way that allow you to really connect to the space within. Great walkable environments tend to have that sense of human habitation. Like, I've never heard anybody say that if they saw a street that had absolutely no windows or completely blank walls, like a bunch of warehouses, said, boy, that was a really walkable street, that was a really pleasant walk I just had. So you can really connect that great walkable neighborhoods tend to have a lot of windows and porches and things like that. So you never feel lonely on a street like that when you have a lot of balconies, but even though there may not be anybody in the picture actually there, but the sense that you feel like people are there is what tends to make a neighborhood and environment very comfortable. Great pedestrian environments like Santa Barbara, Carmel, Palm Beach, all of those had, sometimes the architects, like there's an architect named Meisner in Palm Beach, he would actually have balconies that would go up to a door, or a stair that would go up to a door, and it was just a fake door. So I'm not saying that you should definitely do that all the time, but I'm saying that sometimes the environment, the pedestrian environment is so important to a guy like Meisner that even creating that kind of environment was part of creating that sense that of something place that's welcoming, that's important, that you feel comfortable being part of. The other thing about our architecture we think is important is that you're making space. We're thinking about that particular building not as just an object alone, but that it and the balcony is also shaping the pedestrian experience here, and at the same time it's making a space. So we intentionally created a kind of L shape that when it's faced with another building, you would create a courtyard around it. So this same builder was, like I mentioned, was working on some houses just about, say about 5 years before, 5 or 6 years before, maybe a little more than that, but they were doing really just kind of 3-bedroom houses with a garage out front. So through a lot, and this isn't us, this is really the DAYBREAK team that's been pushing a lot of the builders to do new designs and to, but part of it is being part of that overall vision. That was a big part of it. Some townhouses, we worked with a great home builder, Sago Homes, to develop these. Now, this particular builder has a little bit different brand. It's not necessarily about completely traditional architecture, and you'll see the outcome. But when we worked on a number of sites with them, but this particular site was part of the original Calthorpe master plan, which visualized, these were some of the original visions for commercial one-story buildings with one-story parking lots. And as the market shifted and the change of retail, the DAYBREAK team decided to release this into residential. So the first thing we did was try to break it down into a pedestrian connections and seeing how this kind of commercial part of DAYBREAK, which in some cases was a bit of a pedestrian barrier, it has 2 one-way streets that run past it with cars going really quickly, how it can connect through it, and we can start to break that down into the neighborhood around it. So we designed a series of green spaces, and all of these buildings are shaping both, creating front doors along a very busy road here, but also shaping spaces within various scales. So up here we have, if you can see the mouse, this is a kind of a larger park, a medium-sized park, and then a very small one. And then in between it, we created almost kind of a medieval environment of townhouses getting very, very close together. So in Utah, one thing we've seen is, it's interesting because I come from an environment with, Pittsburgh has townhouses everywhere. You know, we travel all around the country. There are a lot of cities that have a lot of urban density and people living really close together. Salt Lake definitely had a more agricultural background, and even some of the older neighborhoods don't have as many opportunities where you see built examples of buildings really, really close together. So one of the things that was really exciting about this one is it was one of the first examples we could see of this kind of density being built in the Salt Lake market, even looking back historically. So, and what we noticed right off the bat, well, I mentioned that the same parts approach, as I mentioned the previous builder, we were able to assemble those into buildings like that. And we wanted to mention that a lot of these also have that same idea of kind of how does human habitation part of this? How do you create the sense that people are living there, a larger percentage of glass and glazing. But the other reason I wanted to show this slide is that although we were coming from a classical background, a traditional background, we were using modern materials, so it had a classically inspired proportional system and that sort of thing. But it was really about putting modern materials on there and changing the aesthetic. But the same livability, the same idea about creating a great street environment was part of it. Those green spaces you can see here and how they linked together was important, and then they had incredible views from this particular site of the mountains. This is what is great about Daybreak, is you're looking across the other side of the valley. And the kind of sense that we're on a very busy road here, how do we create terraces up to that space? That's the terraces up above. And the other thing that was interesting is we were on this busy road. We created this design for these shutters that rolled and closed, so the building would change as during the time of day, but also create privacy. They're kind of rolling shutters there. You can see them closed at that particular moment. But this is the chance. This is the moment where we're kind of funneling people through and connecting across. But again, the focus is on the pedestrian and about creating a space. So this is a little bit like a room. So thinking about the buildings around it and providing in all of our projects, there's something consistent there. We're always trying to provide an opportunity for people to connect together and to get to know their neighbors. These are not facing parking lots, they're not facing alleys, they're not facing uninhabitable streets, but they're about making a space between them. And then all the walking paths, as I mentioned, bringing the buildings as close as they are together like that was something we were definitely interested in doing. So, we like to think of it as our little medieval city. But this is the idea, and then also the way in which we design a lot of the moments, like these bay windows are to kind of pull you down through in a kind of series of kind of scenographic moments. That also, as a resident in the townhome, you can get out and look down and around in different corners. So one of the things that's tough is when you're bringing people into that density, you have to give them something. You have to give them an opportunity to connect and to have something unique and unique views and opportunities that you wouldn't necessarily get in a single-family home. And again, we're even pushing the densities even more. This is incredibly narrow. This is, and I don't know how many times I show people that, they say, there's no way I ever want to live there. So, but what's interesting is we found is that people are buying these, and people are interested in living at this density. And I've been here in the summer, and there's people up on the rooftops all the time, and you say, hey, how do you like your unit? And you say, oh, I love it up here. So it's definitely working for some people, and that's it's nice. But so the reason I show this is not because I'm saying, hey, everybody wants to live this way. It's that the important thing is that you're providing people choices. What we saw when we first came to Salt Lake was there was not a lot of choices in the way people lived. I mean, the way Ben lives different than Katie, and lives different than me, and different than Paul. We should be able to have that same choice in the housing market. And I'm sure that our shoes are very different too. We can go to a shoe store and we can pick the shoes we like. We have plenty of choices, but we don't have that same choice in the way in which we live in housing. So the point about Daybreak is that it allowed for opportunities for people to live at different densities, at different economic strata. There's entry-level products all the way to over $2 million houses. So that is important about building choices and building opportunities for people moving forward. I'm just going to skim through these. These are a couple of images of some of the work.
Eric, if I may, you said something in that last sentence. You have different economic strata, right? You have entry-level up to $2 million homes.
Yeah.
But they're not segregated in different areas.
That's right.
They're intermixed.
Very close.
And that's traditional design.
That's right.
That we see in areas. I was recently in Galveston, Texas.
Yeah.
Right, in a traditional neighborhood.
Yeah.
And there's smaller homes next to mansions.
Yeah.
Everybody was kind of intermingled so they could see those economic classes.
That's right. That's right. And that's one of the brilliant things about Daybreak is it really broke down a lot of the barriers and sometimes you need one project to get out there to do this. Oftentimes we've shown products like this and people say, well, I don't want that near me because it might affect my real estate value, and things like that. Interestingly, Daybreak's real estate values continue to increase and it continues to be more and more valuable. People do not mind living there. Interestingly enough, building on that point, there was a national research study that showed that a large percentage of Americans would accept affordable housing in their neighborhood if it fit in. That's a really interesting phrase because what it means is that it's an architectural problem, it's not a social problem. Because people recognize that sometimes affordable housing is the teacher, it's the police officer, it's that sort of thing. I mean, my wife's a school teacher, there's no way, if she was a single mom or whatever, she would be able to afford to live in any of the communities or the communities that we live in because we have two incomes, we can put them together. But as a single mom, she would want to live she would be able to stay in the same neighborhood we're in today. So that's important to thinking about these things as an architectural problem. And these are things that as architects are needing to resolve. I'm going to skim through these a little bit more architecture. I'm going to get outside of Utah for a minute, and I'm going to show you, we're going to do a couple more projects and we'll wrap up. But this is a public housing project in New Orleans. We were talking about New Orleans a little bit earlier. This is after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. This is a public housing project that was rendered completely unlivable. A huge number of people had to move out. And the idea was, the question was, number one is, do we rebuild it exactly as it is, or do we build it with mixed income opportunity? So we actually did, it was an older project, but it was definitely a little bit what I talked about, is that was where the poor people live, which is a really unfortunate statement. It's a completely wrong philosophy of how you build communities and build neighborhoods. We had done a pattern book for the state of Louisiana after the hurricanes, but this particular project was part of a public process. We had to communicate with people in Houston because when they moved out, they had scattered around the country. But we asked people about what they wanted in their community. They asked for architecture that fit in. They wanted architecture that was meaningful to the local place. And that's something that's important for you as traditional architects, is to get out and ask people what they want. Some cases, they don't always want classical architecture, traditional architecture, but most often, they want something that's meaningful to a particular community. And so we did a modeling exercise, and we helped analyze. This is one of our figured ground drawings. You can see the buildings of Lafitte in pink there. And then does our solution, which put back the block structure. This is the famous French Quarter right here, and that's the Lafitte Greenway that it sits on. That was our illustrative plan. And some of our vision drawings were in the shred. During our public process, we oftentimes feel that it's very important to do renderings so that people can see what this place looks like. You know, it's funny because we as architects and planners like to look at things from 36,000 feet. We think it looks great, and we kind of move things around, things like that. The people that are looking at these don't have the same training you do, and we actually make the same mistake ourselves. You have to make sure you get down in the pedestrian, as a pedestrian, look at places from on foot to understand the relevance and the importance of the details. So you're doing yourself a disservice if you're only looking at things at the plan level. But it's also important that you think about when you put people down on the sidewalk, that's familiar, and then people also aren't so afraid of the density that you may be providing. Oh, well, yeah, that's high density, but yeah, it looks pretty good. So sometimes they look very much more familiar, and it might be something they want. So these are the images that are under construction. Some of the individual units we were working on here. At various different scales, so attached from single family all the way to attached. And really what it was pretty simple. It was taking the apartment units that were stacked into the buildings and actually bringing them down into house scale and house shapes, and in a way that blended much better with the neighborhood around it. And it became also a mixed income project as well. I think a little faster time. And I think we're able to run. So the mixed-use buildings are getting built now, and it's continuing to be under construction today. Wrapping up here, Orleans Landing is another mixed-income project that we were doing with home builder McCormick Barron in Detroit. The key thing about this one is, I don't know if you recognize that building at the end of the drawing. That's the Renaissance Center by General Motors. Detroit has a long history. If you want to talk about Detroit, see me after the lecture. We can talk about it for hours. Detroit for years, as an auto worker, you made enough money to buy a single-family home. So this is a city that had no tradition didn't have a strong tradition of multifamily living, of townhouses. Most cities have that. So when it went into economic decline, you didn't have scale economies in maintaining homes. And one of the things that they also did was that a huge number of people just cleared out of Detroit altogether. If you scan across, if you look at Google Earth, just scan across the east side of Detroit, and then all of a sudden you get into Grosse Pointe, and you start seeing that all of a sudden, it's vacant, and then all of a sudden every house, every lot is full, it's beautiful streets and things like that. There's no weather difference in Grosse Pointe. I mean, that is something that's really going on politically, and there's some things that are much deeper than that. So when we were working on this project, this was an opportunity to put housing next to downtown. Connecting jobs and housing is something that is a huge, serious problem for here in Salt Lake, and and it's a problem in Detroit as well. I know that as being involved in some of the things in downtown Salt Lake, you have people that are trained, that live in Salt Lake, they can afford to live in Salt Lake, but they don't have the jobs there to work there. Like they may be in the tech industry, and they've got to go all the way to Thanksgiving Point, and then they can't find housing there that suits them. And then you've got jobs in Salt Lake, of which people can't afford, that's where their job is, but they can't afford to live in Salt Lake, so they've got to live somewhere else. So you've got this kind of problem going on, and that's why you have incredible traffic problems on I-15. So what we did is we did do a master plan for there was a whole series of neighborhoods along this corridor. There's downtown Detroit. There's very little housing. This is actually a really interesting project, though. You should check out. This is by Mies van der Rohe, Lafayette Park. But it has for all its strengths and weaknesses, you should look at that. But there is a little bit of housing in the neighborhood. But it has an industrial character along the river. It was actually cleared out at one point. The mayor wanted to put a casino there. So they cleared the neighborhood and never went forward with the casino. This was the Henry Ford's first manufacturing plant. So it had a genuine, really strong history and connection to Detroit. And this is a project where we did a master plan that was thinking about outside of our property line, how do we connect into our neighborhoods around us, and how do we bring that neighborhood down to the river, and how does the river character get back into the neighborhoods. So this helped us create a kind of framework for development. And as I mentioned about being comfortable in your phase one, so of all of that master plan, we really knew that our phase one was one block. So we had to think about that and how do we create complete places. So that's the key message here is whenever you're working, always create a great phase one, but also create a place that works in and of itself. We created a kind of intersection of kind of Main and Main here. This is the location of the Globe building, of the Henry Ford building, which has been unfortunately poorly restored. And it's got some corrugated siding all over it. I don't know what happened. But the Main Street here was something that we felt was an important part of creating an address. We looked at the character. This is the Ford building before it got destroyed. And then some of the existing buildings around it. This is a Stroh's building, which is not too far, which really provided a really great lesson and is important as an architect for you to understand what's going on here. So each floor is different as you go up. So it brings the scale of the building down. This building at the top has three windows. It's got a frame, and then you go to the second. There's a giant order on top of it, wrapping all the way down with different scales of building. So this helped us form our kind of kit of parts of how we're designing elevations for a number of buildings to create an entire streetscape. So each floor has differences and changes all the way up and down every single building to try to bring the scale down for a human. And we designed a kind of almost all of these there's only 3 unit types within, but we were really trying to think about the walkability and the scale of the neighborhood to try to maintain that. So all of the buildings have varying elevations and even varying scales. So we go from corridor buildings to walk-up buildings in between. And we were able to implement all of the buildings pretty close to what we had wanted to have. These are images along the Dequinder Cut, which is one of the connections which headed back into the neighborhoods. That's it as it's built. And the kind of intersection within, and there it is built today. So for some reason, this is kind of funny that auto companies are all in Detroit. So I constantly see this in like auto ads. They'll be driving around through this thing. They like it for filming their commercials. That's not really why we like it, but we do think it's important that you want to make sure you fill out your phase one. I have maybe time for one more project I'm going to try to squeeze through. We're going to end on the last movement, the CNU, the Congress of New Urbanism, which is something that actually came after the advent of UDA. Seaside is a project you should definitely know. It's been widely criticized by a lot of modernist architects, but I just think they just don't understand it. But it's a place that really celebrated the local landscape in a way to create streets that look like this. A lot of times people criticize it because they say every house has to have a picket fence. That's pretty easy because it's all a sand environment. There's no manicured lawns and things like that, and that really sets individual properties and where your property lines are. But what nobody understands is that because the reason why they asked for every house to have a different picket fence was because that what the architect, it was a trick, so that when the architect was working with the homeowner, it would give the homeowner something to do while, to go out and design a fence while they work. So whenever we're working with a client, we've got a client that just, let us work, we really didn't find a good fence for this. for a client. So it definitely happens. But what happens is you see that all the fences are made of wood, everything is very natural materials, but you definitely get the sense of craft and design as part of this, of wherever you go. And one of the things that's really important about Seaside was it created a completely new market. And this is something you'll also see in what DAYBREAK has done here, is that originally in Florida, you either bought land, you bought views of golf, or you bought views of water. I mean, period. I've never seen a place that's so clear. In fact, when you drive outside of Seaside, you'll see towers that are 20-some stories tall, and they have almost no windows on the land side. And then on the other side, it's completely glass. That's literally that the value of the views are so high that they don't even bother putting windows on the other side. So clearly you can see there needed to be a disruptor. Seaside provided a value of urbanism and a value of living on neighborhood and making spaces with buildings and creating opportunities. So this really this is more about representing new design principles and new ways of thinking. It definitely created a value for urbanism and a value for urban life. And there was incredible flexibility actually in the original code. A lot of people can criticize it. They say that you have to do the traditional design. You actually don't. It actually allows for multiple architectures. But what is important about it as architects together, and as you're in architecture school, is knowing that with common agreements, you can work together and you can actually create an incredible ensemble of buildings and places, with spaces that work work together that no one else would ever create as a single hand. And it works well. This is one of our renderings by our illustrator. We were involved a little bit in the master planning for the village center, which had somewhat been like a representation of a lot of cities. It was still kind of evolving design. We were working on these red sites here, which were gateway kind of properties into the center. These are what the sites look like today. These green spaces, so it had never been finished. 30A is the road that you see on the left is actually the key connector through the property. That building's by Stephen Hall. So what you see is that there's a whole series of buildings that all react differently to 30A. 30A, if this is the coast, and the line is 30A, this road is this county road that connects all of them, and all have a different retail relationship and town center relationship to it, and almost none of them actually engage 30A. So as you approach Central Square, those dark spots there are site. So the idea is when you come in, this 30A is actually kind of the Achilles heel of Seaside. I don't think anybody's been there and looked at it, but it really is not the best part of Seaside, and to say the least. It has a very automobile feel. So the idea was, how do we urbanize it, and how do our buildings on these sites, rather than fronting specifically on the green, how do we then create a new address and a kind of sense of compression when you're approaching Seaside? And the idea of creating these kind of gate moments on either side. So immediately we said, oh geez, yeah, put two buildings there. That probably happens everywhere. And we realized that actually it didn't happen anywhere in the United States. We found a couple of examples. There's really not that many precedents where you actually have two buildings on either side. Interestingly, in Pittsburgh, one of the bridges, there's this incredibly gorgeous building. It's now a Renaissance Hotel. And on the other side, there's this parking garage that's like 3 stories tall. It used to have a pair. And somebody talked the guy on the right to tearing down the building and put a 3-story parking garage. And I always have wished I had that kind of sales ability. So those are our sites. We looked at these building sites here, and the idea again was about how do we make spaces? How do our buildings make pedestrian environments? And so a lot of the architecture was being moved into, a lot of the retail experience was moved off of some of those spaces and into the center, which created a new kind of pedestrian diagram for how the city works. Now, we weren't asked to do this. This is something we do anyway. We always try to think about when you're approaching a building, how do you get to a building? As an urbanist and as an urban designer, and this is important as a designer for you thinking about this, is if you're ever going to a place, if you're designing a place, think about the fact that the person's experience of going to that place starts when they get in the car. It doesn't actually start when they walk to get to the door. It certainly starts even more so when they get out of their car or wherever they're getting to or how you see. So thinking about, if you want to design great architecture, you need to think about the experience in approaching that place as well. That's just as important. So thinking about this, we wanted to understand the retail diagram and how people will be circulating around this new place. The yellow is the cars and the blue is the pedestrian. But we wanted to create basically the sense of plazas and the sense of arrival. This building is actually there. It's a kind of key obelisk, a key connector to the beach. These are planned red buildings there. And then some of the things that have really grabbed hold were kind of like happened. They were doing Airstream trailers far before food trucks were cool. And they were incredibly successful along 30A, and it's been kind of a great kind of new sense and a new texture to Seaside. That's kind of quite a lot of fun. They also have little plazas and things like that. But the idea of how we sense that sense of arrival was important. This is some of our design for the beach side. And when you're approaching, the obelisk was there. We wanted to create a kind of sense of 2-story, 3-story, 4-story, so you get a kind of sense of pinwheeling space. It happens to also work with some of the building heights of the buildings. And these buildings also were going to be residential buildings making civic space, which is really important design. When you actually have public space coming right up to it, you need to think about how these things work. So we had kind of a low side with kind of windows punches, but the sense of overscaling the windows, those are 8-foot tall windows, to kind of create the sense of a kind of piano overlay. And then the small windows above are kind of like in a large cornice. All of these things were, and then each building has like subtle design differences to each other. This is the 30A side. With this building, have a kind of retail, but also that archway, which gets you from the beach side into a space, into a complete square, but then also telling you that there's another square beyond, and that's the large central square. This is a sketch of mine that's going into the space, through, and then beyond. So again, the kind of staircase up is kind of leading you up and kind of reinforcing that kind of pinwheel environment with different levels around it was conscious and definitely thought through. Here's the loggia heading into the other loggia around the square, and the buildings that are on the other side, which is next to, this is the Machado and Silvetti building, had 3 units over a ground level retail. So all of the retail, most of the retail in Seaside is all 1 story, like as in 10 feet. The idea of creating a 20-foot retail space was important for us in kind of getting a much grander retail. But again, this kind of has a kind of simple ADA rhythm, but we try to kind of maximize the glazing. One of the things, again, I'll just give one more lesson before I wrap this up. As a classicist, it's really important to know what are the things that you can take from other movements that you can use moving forward. And one of the things that modernism did was it really created a wonderful connection between the interior and exterior. In fact, you can live inside and out. So really maximizing, when you're drawing buildings, really try to maximize the glazing you can. That'll create a better livability from within, but it also makes buildings much warmer and much more comfortable when you're drawing. So this particular kind of is a kind of two-story home there, which is kind of read like a lantern from a distance. The other thing you're always going to have to deal with as a designer is dealing with the car. So the Machado and Silvetti building just has these kind of arches, but we really try to consciously think about how do we mold those into balconies and create, instead of having kind of a low scale here, how do we create a tall scale that then also works for the architecture above. We're going to talk about, if anybody wants to ask me about autonomous vehicles and questions, please do. I certainly have an opinion about that. But one of the problems you're going to deal with until autonomous vehicles come around is that the car will always be the first thing you deal with whenever you're dealing with design. So you always have to consciously think, where does it be located? How many cars do you need? And then the rest of your design is going to completely revolve around that. So that's incredibly important. But I'll pretty much wrap this up here. This is the kind of view of one of the other corners, working its way into the Stephen Hall building. So I'm going to wrap up with a couple comments, and then we can get into a couple of questions if you have. Is always, when you're working from here on out, you're always going to be working with spare parts. And make sure you're considering creating urban environments while you do. Focus on definitely kind of creating environments that are supported by a pedestrian. As we looked at all of these planning movements at the beginning of this lecture and into the design recommendations, the ones that are successful are the ones that were thinking at the human scale, and thinking about how people connect together. Those are the most treasured neighborhoods moving forward. Think about your phasing. Think about how you can complete places and wherever you do. Seek ways to, and this was kind of in between the lines, seek ways to participate in the design of environment around you. As I mentioned, when you drive down the I-15, design is not a big part of that. As when you come out of architecture school, it is so important to have people like Katie here, who's working for DAYBREAK, who's helping make design happen and helping implement great design. It's not all, it's important about working in those kind of roles, but it's also who's working at the DOT, who's designing the freeways that are going over that are going across our landscape. How can they be much more human scale? How can they be something that can participate in the landscape around it? And how do you integrate those design processes? And finally, this is really important, is that all of the work that we do is what we're really thinking about is participating in the future of policy and shaping policy to help create these frameworks and networks for moving forward. So as much as you can, be part of the shaping of policy within your own city. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. If you have questions for Eric, please go ahead.
I'm wondering what you can do. I'm just a citizen in my city, but my city is laid out really sprawl type,
Which city, by the way?
Orem.
Orem, okay.
The city of Orem.
Okay.
It's really sprawled, really is based around State Street. It's really ugly, and we really don't have a city center
Yeah.
except for University Park, the mall, basically the center. And so how do you go backwards and try to help the city that, how do you try to do that?
We had a long conversation about that right before. It's a long conversation. There's a couple of steps that is important. One is educating your city council and your planning commission as best as you can about great design. You're laughing. Are you a city council member?
No. I've thought about joining the city council, but
Yeah. I know. Well, let me go through the steps. So that's one. And that may not be the easiest one, but certainly they're the gatekeepers for one thing. The second thing is, I think, is finding a common ground that everyone can agree on about what your city's expectations are and mapping that out. What is important to the people of Orem in implementation? Is it walkability? It maybe not. Is it sense of place and character? Does it need part? Is it that you have high quality design? What are the things that you can get, if you can get a kind of set of dialogue and a set of design principles of which everybody's operating under? That's something that's also helpful to help get a community discussion. Talking about walkability is important. I certainly would recommend, it's very difficult dealing with State Street. And that's one of the problems, is trying to cross State Street. Definitely trying to talk to UDA as much as possible about that you may not get very far. But it's worth the conversation to engage them so they know that this is an issue that's important to them. Until you get a kind of walkable opportunity, it's very difficult for people to talk about high quality architecture because they're driving by it so fast. It doesn't, I'm serious. So it's hard to get people to convene and to think about their place in a different way when people are driving at that speed. So those are some things I think that are important. There's some other small scale things you can create. Design panels for your community. In Pittsburgh, we have the Contextual Design Advisory Panel, which I'm on. It's not always as successful as it could be because there could be a better process, but you may consider a panel like that also makes recommendations. So what happens is if an applicant has a project, they would have to walk through your design panel to get and then you would be able to work with them and have a conversation. And with what's good for a developer, the kind of key thing is you think to yourself, well, what's in it for the developer? With their success, they may get more green lights through planning commissions and city council. So if you can create a neighborhood group that feels it's important, you will become something that can be a participant in the process and not necessarily obstructive. So I hope that helps.
Kind of like Park City, is that what?
I don't know Park City's process. I mean, I've been to Park City, but I don't know their process very
Like
well.
they
Park
have
City, I've heard,
design
Do they have, yeah,
limitations to
They-
anything?
they do, and I think I've heard that it's a pretty strong one, maybe too strong. So, so I don't know if that's, so you might want to also be careful which ones you use as a model, and I don't know enough about Park City, so I do a little investigation. But I know that there are some cities that have been successful in doing that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, yes,
The slide you just had on the screen
yeah.
was the only one that I saw in your presentation that had any indication of accommodation of public transportation.
That's a good question. We actually have public transportations actually in the lion's share of the projects that we work on. Right now, we're working on, I'm the principal in charge for a project. We're doing a new light rail connection, this new Silver Line across Charlotte, which has 24 stations, and we're doing stationary plans all the way around it. You're absolutely right. I didn't show enough about transit. And transit area development is certainly something that's important to everything. However, I would mention that DAYBREAK is a completely transit-oriented community itself. It has the end of the red line, and there's right now 2 stations that have been built. There's a 3rd station, and Garden Park, all the pedestrian connections were actually oriented to the station. I think you bring up a good point. I think transit is the future for our efforts, and also the project I mentioned in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, has a huge high-speed rail corridor which connects through it and connects it into the region. So sometimes they're in there. Maybe I didn't highlight it as much as I could have, but I'm glad you brought that up because I got a chance to say that. But
The follow-on question
yeah,
is, I didn't see any illustration or accommodation for other alternative forms of transportation such as bicycles.
good question.
And all the
Yeah.
illustrations of pedestrians appear to be leisure walking rather than people walking to work. Or walking to a bus stop.
Yeah, actually, I totally disagree with that,
Or
but
accommodation.
yeah.
People use these alternate forms of transportation.
That's a good, it's a good comment. When we do the illustrations, they're certainly meant to be flowery and, people interacting with each other, which is really what the message is. But almost all of our, like for example, the one in New Orleans, the one you mentioned in Orleans, I just mentioned the one in Detroit, is walking distance to downtown Detroit. There's very few projects of housing, and that was a huge effort to get that implemented. That actually has a bus stop just on the other side of one of those slides, so it's probably 100 yards from the bus stop, which gets you right into downtown Detroit. People can walk to work at the General Motors Renaissance Center. But that one, the whole theme of that one was about connecting jobs and housing and being able to walk to work, which is something that's been completely lost. In fact, it never really was a lot of walk to work opportunities in Detroit. So walking and connecting that kind of environment is certainly a big part of what we do. In fact, I also didn't mention, we have a lot of projects that have a lot of basic uses within it. And maybe I didn't show enough examples. I showed you 6 of, like I said, 2,300 projects. We worked in every state in the United States, except we haven't been able to break the South Dakota market. I don't know if you have any connection there. So it definitely is something that is hard to
Just another example, Lehigh City and Draper have recently on a cooperative basis built a bicycle trail
Yeah,
around Point of the Mountain so that people can bicycle to work.
yeah, that's
Or
right.
Lehigh and avoid the freeways and other vehicle roads.
Yeah.
And I see nothing in any of your plans to provision for bicycle lanes on the streets or accommodations of the sort.
I'm sorry to feel right.
Safety.
Yeah, I'm sorry to feel right, because I didn't show any of the slides, but we have bicycle lanes in almost all of our projects, and we definitely have a bicycle network, not those particular exact ones. I think actually I didn't show the one in, this is the largest bicycle trail in Detroit, is the one, the DeQuinder Cut. This particular trail is the largest bike trail in Detroit, goes all the way around Detroit, and this project was actually part of framing the end of that. And then it connected back to this one here, which then connects it back in downtown Detroit. So maybe I didn't highlight it, but it's definitely, I cycle to work, and I also take public transit to work, and a lot of our employees do the same. So I'm glad you mentioned that, because it gave me a chance to mention it too. Yeah.
I just want to ask you a question about Daybreak. I haven't had a chance to visit yet, so I don't know a lot about it. But most
James,
of,
right here, you can-
most of what I've seen, it looks mostly residential. And it's great that it's walkable, but walkability doesn't really, it's not really useful if you're not having a mix of uses to, you know, is there like plans for like corner markets and for?
There is, yeah, and
is
I'm
there-
glad you brought that up, because there's a small scale footprint Harmon's grocery store that's gonna be coming into, I hope I can mention that, okay. So,
We haven't had a lot of secrets.
yeah, sorry, I know more than I should. So that's coming into Daybreak, so you're gonna have a walkable grocery store. There's definitely, they even built a grocery store model really early. They actually built it ahead of market, and what happened was it sat vacant for so long, they actually put restaurants in. So they have several restaurants that are walkable to the restaurants and small businesses, and they have a small business footprint building for businesses like the Daybreak offices, but others as well. The downtown, the section, what I should mention though that's important is that where the light rail goes through, that particular downtown of Daybreak is largely open right now because it was a little bit ahead of the commercial market. We did a scale comparison when we did some early master planning for that. That is exactly the size of downtown Salt Lake. So there's enough capacity, so you can visualize downtown Salt Lake can actually be in the very heart and center of Daybreak. There's a residential neighborhood on the east and a residential neighborhood on the west, and right in the center is the light rail. So we're hoping, what's really exciting is, as part of the Daybreak vision, is to create a true city in the fact that you have businesses, and there are some. University of Utah has a medical office building that's there. There's several office buildings that are going to be coming out of the ground shortly. In fact, I think University of Utah is actually doing some expansion as well. So there'll be a lot more businesses coming to Daybreak. But like I said, it was a little bit ahead of market. It was a little bit too bad as some of the tech companies that ended up in Thanksgiving Point in a kind of an automobile framework, which they're starting to do a good job of now connecting people more into. There's certainly an opportunity to, there would have been an opportunity to capture more of them because there would have been that opportunity that you're describing, which would have been great. So when you look at it, when you drive through it, think to yourself, okay, when you see all those empty parts in the middle, this is where all the business is. So,
Yeah, quick question. With Daybreak, did you have a reduction in parking requirements that were allowed in that area? And if so, did that allow you flexibility to do more within that site on a larger scope?
that's a great question. On most all the parking is done on kind of a market basis right now, but what the banks will lend for and what people want and what builders are trying to build for. So we're doing some high density housing right now, which is parked at a little bit over one car per unit right on the transit station. They certainly would love to do less parking. Parking costs a lot of money. And also, when you think about it, your size of your parking space as a planning module will use about 400 square feet, which happens to be about the size of some small studio apartments. So when you think about it, I mean, it's amazing. And when you think about the cost of a parking space is maybe $10,000 or $15,000. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. But when you put it in a garage, it's $30,000 to $40,000 a parking space. So you just think about what that kind of investment is. It's a lot. In terms of in Salt Lake, though, there was a project that was just approved at 0.57 spaces per unit. As you know, in Salt Lake, they've reduced the parking requirement to 0. So they can technically, in most areas of downtown, I'm not sure if it's all of it, but a lot of it, so they can technically do 0. But the problem is the banks aren't looking for that. So, and this is another thing going back to participating in the design profession as much as you can. The fact that the banks won't loan for it, sometimes it's not, they're looking at numbers, that's what they do, So, helping in implementing opportunities for lower parking. Getting back to your question about Daybreak, the residential side is usually like 2 per unit, and it's because a lot of people still use 2 cars. And sometimes it's tough because I think you mentioned about jobs and where people are working. There aren't a lot of jobs in Daybreak right now. So a lot of people do need a lot of people do take the train to work. But there's not as many opportunities to drive if you're not working in Salt Lake, it's not as easy. So there's definitely not. I wouldn't say there's a parking problem. I mean, I'm sure there's probably people that get frustrated about something with cars because that's just the way people are. But they're certainly trying to do as best as they can in keeping people parking on the street and and parking fewer spaces per unit for sure.
So you talked a little bit about designing overall design for today, and then also looking towards the future,
Yeah.
making it sustainable for the future,
Yeah.
and balancing that.
Yeah.
but also thinking, 20, 30, 40 years in the future for urban planning.
Yeah, I mean, just generally, I would think whenever you design something that is complete, and it's tough because DAYBREAK is not complete, but when you design a moment, that then catalyzes other opportunities in the same way. And we'll also start, and always pushing the envelope for things like parking, like this gentleman just asked about, is how do you really push that, but one thing that's important, what we've learned a little bit is Americans are relatively conservative in their tastes, buying tastes, is that you can only get so far. Like, it's really difficult to sometimes make that huge leap to something really different. You have to kind of build a model that other people will chase. So staying out in front of something is one thing. I think the future, and if anybody wants to challenge me on this, I'm sure, I'm a big fan of the autonomous vehicle opportunities, is the fact that, or it's certainly using Uber more and more, car ownership is going down. Building less and less parking is going to be a huge influence on you as designers and giving you opportunities to design for other things. So, I mean, the fact that you can do something about the fact that 45,000 people per year, something like that, die as a result of automobile accidents, and what is it, like 95% of that is human error. I mean, the fact that we can do something about that, just to put that in perspective, I mean, everybody says, oh gosh, Vietnam was a horrible mistake because we expended a lot of American lives. I think it was like 60,000 people died in Vietnam. So, when you think about it, we can make a huge, the fact that many people are dying from cars, if we ever were to introduce cars into today's environment and nobody were dying, we were going to say, okay, we're going to give you this big hunk of metal, and by the way, 50,000 people are going to die next year as a result of it, no one would ever accept it. So how does that influence you as a planner and designer? The problem is that today, we're constantly trying to spend a lot of time talking about making places safer to walk around and safer to connect to your neighbor and all this kind of stuff, which is not something that's commonly designed. The other thing we're also doing is as I mentioned really briefly, every time you design, the first thing you think about, the absolute first thing you think about is how many cars do we have, how are they parked, and then you look at the residual space, and that's where living space is. And you get to play around with it and move it around. But we'll have a great opportunities if we can think about how do we future-proof and design for fewer and fewer cars and less cars influencing the site, and thinking more about people and how people are going to use a place and people are going to enjoy places. And more we're seeing people getting interested in that and people flocking to those kind of places for sure. Yeah.
Maybe just one more question?
Go ahead.
Someone else?
Are you-
Okay. Well, I was just thinking, because I've talked to a couple people about this, and their biggest thing is like, well, that's really inconvenient for traffic, and that's just going to cause traffic if you make the city more walkable. Because people, unfortunately, the reality, what they brought up to me is, I'm still working in Provo, and I still live in Lehigh.
Yeah.
So making Provo more walkable is going to make it worse for me. And that, like, it's so hard to convince people to just see.
Yeah. It's hard. My thing is like tough. I mean, there are places to drive. That's too bad, because there are places, and this is really what it gets down to quality of life. Because you bring up a good point. There are places where you can drive fast. That's the freeway. There are places you should not be driving fast, and that's in the city. And if it's that important that you get to some place 5 minutes faster, and then you may take somebody's life in your hands, is it really that important? And that's the other problem, is that I think people are so focused on things that, that they are not thinking that adding 5 minutes to their drive just because, and that kind of thinking comprehensively, there are solutions that can make driving in the city, if you are thinking that way, and you can talk to really enlightened traffic planners, that they can actually, like you said, they can find ways to make a place work better. And a lot of times, and they're doing a lot of this stuff in Pittsburgh, and what's happening is that initially a lot of the car drivers are fighting it. They still sometimes get frustrated, but we're noticing that at the same time, they can find ways to make it the traffic flow better. Automated lights and all kinds of other things can actually make it work better as well. So, a lot of times there's just a huge amount of waste on that and wasted time, but in reality, human life is worth saving, and it's important. So, thank you very much.